This is vision 8. So this is the 8th in a sequence of presentations on vision, which is the beginnings of consciousness. We're following a tradition which goes back to Paleolithic times. The tradition is that though we come out of nature, though we emerge out of nature, something happens to us, or we are capable of having something happen to us, which takes us out of ourselves. In Paleolithic times, there were two primordial ways in which a person could come out of themselves. The first was a masculine form, and that masculine form would generally be known as terror. You could be scared out of your wits. You could jump out of your shoes. You could be so scared, so frightened, so terrorized as to jump out of yourself. The other was a feminine form, which was ecstasy. Even the term ecstasis, standing outside of. So that in very primordial human origins, terror and ecstasy were time-honored, recognized states of going outside of yourself. And those states slowly had to be worked into the life that one was living. And out of this came the need, apparently about 40,000 years ago, to arrange a series of images, a series of events into a process known as initiation, so that you could experience the going outside of yourself without having to be terrorized, without having the special and fleeting situation that led to ecstasy, that one could choreograph, one could make a set with movements and images that would carry you through in an initiatory way. And so a third kind of standing outside of oneself developed. That third kind was known as transcendentalism. The transcendental. The going outside of yourself, not by terror or ecstasy, but by a profound jump of wisdom. And so we have, at the very earliest records of what we today would call art, Paleolithic art, cave art, the art of men and women of, say, 35,000 years ago. And we can see right away, in the very first instances of Paleolithic art, that the use of it was for an initiation into a transcendental state, going outside of oneself, and the earliest expressions of it utilized the natural qualities of terror and ecstasy. So that, for instance, when one looks at an Ice Age temple, because that's what they were, a Paleolithic temple like Lascaux, one sees that the grand salon, where the mural is of all the animals that support life, the reindeer, the bison, and so forth, all of the animals that support life are in this grand salon. And that one passes through this in various stages and comes eventually to the rear of the cave. And in the rear of the cave at Lascaux, there was a sudden plunge. The bottom of the cave falls out and there's a plunge. Exactly at that point, on the wall is drawn the earliest image that we have of a human figure. A complete human figure. It's a man. But it's a man who has a bird's head. the bird as an image of something that is able to fly. It's a man whose head is able to fly. It's a Paleolithic image of transcendent experience. But when one looks at this stick figure with the bird head, one notices it's a man because the penis is erect. But the penis is not erect out of ecstasy, but out of sheer terror. Because accompanying this figure is the figure of a very dangerous rhinoceros-like beast. And what they were showing is that this sudden fall, where nature suddenly plunges away from one, in the face of sheer terror, one can transmute the natural terror into a transcendental wisdom experience. You can transmute. Instead of having the experience be one of terror, the man transmuted his terror into wisdom. That's why he has a bird's head, though the penis is erect in fear. It's a fear which is not debilitating, but a fear which is exhilarating. I'm sorry to be so explicit, but it's a point that needs to be given. I remember a friend of mine, a Finnish-American friend who was a jet pilot in Vietnam, and he said, "You have never had an erotic experience like being in a fighter jet in full control of it at Mach 2 and just climbing in long sweeps to come in against an enemy that you know you can beat." He said it's a big problem with jet pilots to be able to control those kinds of physiological erotic responses. They are trained to transmute that into attention, not to lose the attention. It's a modern 20th century version of the old Paleolithic that we must learn to transmute. Not just transmute terror into transcendental vision, but to transmute ecstasy also into transcendental vision. And through tens of thousands of years, men and women on this planet have understood that at the deep core of life, we must not only live in a nature which is given to us, we're born into it. There's nothing we can do about it. We are here. But we also have this capacity to go outside of nature, and we need to explore that realm which is outside. And the outside has different dimensions. It has an outside which is underneath the world, so it's a netherworld. Or it's an outside which is above the world, so it's an overworld, a celestial world, a heaven. So there's a heaven and a netherworld, there's a hell, an underground. But in addition to there being an above and a below, there's also a deeper realm, a within. And so these three spatial dimensions are characteristic paradigms for the experience of transcendence, whether it's going below in terms of terror or going above in terms of ecstasy, or whether going within in terms of a transcendence. It's this kind of quality, a three-dimensional spatial quality. Now for us, in our education, at this point, Vision 8, we're noticing that the whole natural cycle that we investigated in the first year, we began with nature because that's the only place we had to begin with. But we soon discovered that nature was never objective, that nature was always in flux, always in motion, that the best one could say about nature is that it's an emerging process that's ongoing. And where existence comes into objectivity is in a level different from nature, one that we use a traditional word for it, which is ritual. What we do. And that to the extent of the fact that our actions, the fact that our actions are able to be trained to do some kind of reaction, some kind of response in a ritual way, in a rote way, ensures more and more objectivity. And so the certainty, the sense of confidence that one exists is because one is doing the right thing in the right way. And so ritual comportment guarantees existence. And not just for men and women, but the understanding was that it's what plants do that guarantee their existence. It's what animals do that guarantees their existence. It's what minerals or metals in the mountain, in the ground, do that guarantee their existence. But that Paleolithic men and women who were content to follow nature, to participate in nature, at some time after the last ice age, roughly 10,000 years ago, 12,000 at the most, in various parts of the world, the range of mountains in between present Iran and Iraq, the upper reaches of Thailand, and other places in the world, about 10 to 12,000 years ago, men and women began to understand that you could change plants, you could change animals, you could tame certain animals and have the benefit of having the animals on hand. You didn't have to always follow their hunting cycle, their migratory cycle. You could tame plants, you could select them out, and you could learn to breed them. And so the Paleolithic was replaced by the Neolithic. The Paleolithic that followed wild nature, the Neolithic that tamed nature to suit men and women. And in this taming of nature, the old Paleolithic transmutation of ecstasy and terror into transcendence was carried likewise into a new form. That the transformation was no longer left to the wild dimensions of nature, but that whole process was also tamed. The taming of the process of transmutation became an art of transformation. And one finds about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, even 9,000 years ago at the most, one begins to find in the Neolithic evidences that there are special centers set aside, just like the old caves were set aside for Paleolithic transmutation. In the Neolithic, there are centers set aside for a transformation. One finds in the Anatolian highlands of Turkey, a site known today as Katolhulyek, that by 7000 BC was already what we call an early city. But when one looks at it, the early city was a ceremonial center for transformation. It was a religious center that was there to tame the process of initiation, to make sure that it was reproducible almost on demand. It was available, and the inculcation of these techniques went hand in hand with the taming of the plants, the taming of the animals. So man's psychic energy was tamed along with the plants and the animals. And one finds a great cycle of stability that comes out of this. About 5,000 years ago, the Neolithic stability was completely shattered. The Neolithic had emerged out of the Paleolithic in a very quiet revolution. One of the great early writers on the Neolithic Revolution was a woman named Sonia Cole, who was trained by L.S.B. Leakey, who wrote a little pamphlet for the British Museum in London about the Neolithic Revolution, about how this quiet revolution, that the taming of plants and animals in the Neolithic was like the taming of fire in the Paleolithic. It was a Promethean change, but it was very quiet. Whereas about 5,000 years ago, the transformation to a symbolic civilization out of the Neolithic was very violent. It was sudden. It was like lightning and thunder. It was truly like a romantic German drama where the lightning strikes and all of a sudden everything is completely different. And so in symbolic civilization, the transformation became identified with some kind of magical change. Sudden, unexpected, powerful, irrevocable change. Nothing quiet at all about it. And so transformation, about 5,000 years ago, became very dicey, became very perilous, powerful, because just as the Neolithic became much more powerful than the Paleolithic, the symbolic civilizations of 5,000 years ago became so much more powerful than their neighbors that they simply began to take them over, and you have the birth of large empires. About 3000 BC is the first time that one finds the unification of Egypt. It's the first time that one finds the Sumerian unification of all the cities in that delta. It's about the first time that one finds in India the great Harappan civilization coming up and taking over the whole Indus River Valley. One finds in the China of that day the beginning rumblings that led to dynastic China. So whether it's the Yangtze river system or the Indus or the Tigris-Euphrates or the Nile, all of these river system civilizations of 5,000 years ago became extremely powerful. But their survival, their energeia, their stability of dynamic extension was all founded on the ability to control this violent revolution of transformation by changing the minds of their people, changing the minds of other people to see in the way in which they wanted. And one finds as a concomitant of that revolution the development of written language. Language which had forever before that had always been on an oral basis. Suddenly the basis began to shift so that the really powerful language was a written language. One can almost reduce it to a truism. One could say, it doesn't matter what you say, it is written here in your silence. This development of a written language became a signal that what was the function leading the whole judgment about what was real and what was right now shifted to the mind. And the sense that one depended upon more than any other sense was the eye. Because when one goes back to Neolithic civilization, one finds it's not the eye but the ear that's center. It's not thinking that's so important, but feeling. Neolithic civilization was founded upon a feeling-toned intelligence primarily. Whereas symbolic civilizations are founded upon a thinking, visual-toned apprehension. And we live at a time now where there is yet another epochal change happening. That the whole fulcrum, the whole focus of the way in which men and women are going to live, can now live, has changed. And the focus is no longer on the Paleolithic or the Neolithic or symbolic civilization. All three are being left behind. But the new that's coming out is so new as to not be capable of apprehension. The old Paleolithic wild techniques of shamanistic initiation really don't apply anymore at all. The techniques of feeling-toned intelligence don't really apply anymore. Even the technique of thinking-informed mind don't apply anymore. They apply only in a historical sense, only in a sense of bringing someone up through the cycle of maturation, through like the embryo in the womb that goes through all the cycles of life and then gets born. And so a great deal of traditional wisdom, indispensable still, but indispensable in a historical sense. And one recapitulates this development simply to get current with the threshold of modern transformation. And one doesn't even have a name. Perhaps one can't even call it a civilization anymore. Symbolic civilization was founded on great cities, whereas what's coming is founded on whole star systems. Dwarfs even planets, much less cities. And so the scale is just not imaginable, because imagination is a function of feeling and of development of the ear. And it's not a function of thought, of imagery in the mind. The pictures in the mind have nothing to do with the scale of consciousness that's necessary for maturation now, for transformation now. And so this education is meant to alert us in a short recapitulation. 1 year is nothing to recapitulate the whole history of the universe for us. It's nothing. And the whole second year that we're beginning now, we're in the 8th presentation, the 8th week of the second year. The whole second year is taking a look at what has happened on these higher levels, the levels of vision, the levels of art, the levels of history, the levels of science. Because it's somewhere in the ecology of these four, not the ecology of nature, ritual, myth, and symbol, but it's somewhere in the ecology of vision, art, history, and science that the new has been born. That whatever is coming out now, whatever is effective now, is no longer effective in the old terms. The old ways don't work anymore because they're structurally inoperative. They are, in terms of the new reality, flawed and ineffective. Not that in themselves and in their own time that they were flawed, not at all. They worked very well. They no longer work at all. Now, about 2,000 years ago, that is to say about midway, 40, 50%, 60% of the way through the development of symbolic civilizations, one of the documents that one could look at from that time period by one of the wisest individuals of the first century of the Common Era, first century AD, Plutarch, who was a master of the mysteries of transformation in terms of symbolic civilization. And we have about 20 or 30 of his books from antiquity, so we have a lot of his work. One of the small works that survived is about why the ancient oracles no longer work. And Plutarch writes about 2,000 years ago that it was a noticeable thing in his time, in his lifetime, that men and women all over the world ask a very similar question. Why do the old oracles no longer work? That either men and women of previous centuries, of previous millennia, were duped, and that these oracles had never worked, which then he dismisses and says these were very intelligent men and women. And we can see from the effect that the Delphic oracle used to work. It used to be an oracle. It is no longer working. That the oracle of Zeus at Dodona, where the wind would come through the oak groves in such a way that one could hear, if one was sensitive enough psychically, one could hear in the sound of the rustles of the oak grove the voice of prophecy. And that there were certain men and women who were trained to do this. At Delphi, it was young women who were trained to do this. And at Dodona, it was old men. That the oracle at Delphi was usually a young woman who was there until her puberty had completed itself, till her body physiologically had come into that of a woman. That the Delphic oracle had to be a female who was in between being a girl and not yet a woman. That she was in this physiological change, that she was susceptible to the nuances of transformational energy from her physiology. And she would be set in a tripod stool over this jagged chasm in a cave. And the vapors and fumes from deep below, from the netherworld, would rise and intoxicate this adolescent female in such a way that she would speak. And she would speak in these terse ways, the most famous being the response that was given to Socrates, that he was the wisest of all men. Socrates, who realized that he was certainly not the wisest of all men. He knew many people much smarter than he was. Don't forget, he lived in a town where his neighbors were Sophocles and Herodotus and Aeschylus. And he knew he was not the smartest, and yet it took him a while to realize that he was the smartest in the sense that he knew that he didn't know. He knew the limits of his intelligence. So that the ancient oracles in Plutarch's time, Plutarch was a high priest of the mystery religions that had a whole Platonic development from Socrates. He said the oracles no longer work. We live in a time where the prophecies of the past no longer work. They no longer function. Not that they were not true. They were most certainly true. They are not now true any longer. Something new must come out. Just as in Plutarch's time, something new had to come out. Some completely new wisdom. Or if one wants to be more conservative or traditional, some new version of ancient wisdom. And in like manner, we're having a front row seat. We're having a conscious front row seat on the development of something which will, presumably for the next millennia or so, be a form of transformational savvy for men and women. We're here at Ringside at the beginning. And we're using an ancient technique in modern dress in order to help us do this. We're taking the old Paleolithic seasonal cycle. We're taking the annual cycle of 4 seasons as one kind of a context. And within each season, we're taking a Neolithic version of the tamed way to initiate. The tamed way for initiation is archetypally that one takes 3 corners of a square and allows you to intuit the 4th corner. That if you cannot intuit, if you cannot engender the creativeness to have a gestalt of the 4th corner, once given 3, then you have failed the initiation. The symbolic is always not to show you the corners, but to show you the center only. And if you cannot get the resonances from the center, then you have failed the initiation. In the Paleolithic, you had to adapt yourself to the wild vicissitudes of terror and ecstasy and somehow learn to transmute that. You had to undergo terror, or you had to undergo ecstasy that was unbearable. Not a pleasant ecstasy, an unbearable ecstasy, or an unbearable terror. It was the whole essence of a shamanic experience. You're thrown into it, beyond hope. But in the Neolithic, it was this planned gestalt where you were given 3 of the 4 corners, and you had to intuit the 4th corner yourself. You had to have the capacity to recognize the square. And so within the wild cycle of an annual seasonal completeness, which is Paleolithic, each season, each quarter of that year is dealt with in a Neolithic way, where books are given to us to indicate, pair of books for each one to indicate where the corners are. And then the 4th section, you're given just one book. And if you can't make the 4th corner out of just that one book, then you didn't get it. Go back and start over. Run yourself through it again. That eventually the juices will begin so that you can learn to get it, because you can be trained to. In ancient times, there used to be wonderfully complex, devastatingly clever ways to weed out people who were not right for it. In our age, it's such a junkyard of chaos that you don't have to have any initiation at all except just to offer it. People weed themselves out faster than a genius could weed you out. The biggest obstacle is the self-confidence and tenacity and ability to persevere. In our age, just having that is already a sign that you're ready. And so anyone who comes through on a continuous basis, that's it. The wisdom traditions of the 16th century used to say self-selection is the only guaranteed weeding out process. People will weed themselves out because by this stage of the development of mankind, we are carrying such a huge heritage of possibility that only if you yourself decide to take the next step can the next step be taken. So within each quarter of the 2 years, the 2 Paleolithic cycles of our course, each quarter has a Neolithic presenting of a pair of texts to show you that corner, and then a second pair of texts to show you that corner, then a third pair of texts to show you that corner, and then just one text. 4 weeks on one corner, 4 weeks on another, 4 weeks on the third, and a 13th week just to give you that 4th corner, which you have to fill in yourself. Otherwise, the gestalt is not going to be made. I'm not going to make it for you. Not that I can't make those gestalts. I can make those gestalts and present them in spades. It does no good whatsoever. If we lived in Neolithic times, it would be fine. If we lived 8,000-9,000 years ago, this would be very easy to do, with the recognition that 8,000 or 9,000 years ago it was difficult to do. But now it's nothing. To master Paleolithic wisdom, it's very easy. To master Neolithic wisdom is very easy. It's difficult because it takes a little time and it takes tenacity to master symbolic civilization wisdom. But that can be done within 2 years. But what's new? There are no masters whatsoever. And so if you don't develop the ability to fly, don't jump out of the nest. Because there's not only no air, there's no gravity. And possibly no time and no space. It makes it very difficult to tell whether you're going anywhere, or that there's anywhere to go, or that there's anyone for whom going is meaningful. Those who are following understand. The Vajrayana calls that lam rim, no boundaries. One of the most interesting of all the Tibetan gurus who used to teach lam rim in the West, Chogyam Trungpa, characterized it once. He said it's like riding barebacked and also bare behind. You don't have any stirrups, you don't have any saddle, you don't have any reins, and the horse is untamed and you're nude. Well, if you don't know how to ride naturally with intelligence and adapt quickly, you're going to go off. You won't go anywhere. And so it's this kind of a situation. What is new is completely barebacked and bare behind. There are no saddles there at all. There are no reins. Those who promise saddles and reins, that's a sure sign of skull and crossbones. That reads poison right away. Those who say that they know, lie. Those who teach some technique that works, deceive. It's as simple as that. It's a good litmus test. The best that can be done is only the promise of a couple of years of tenacity and hard work, and after that to let it settle and stew for a while, and then experience that it begins to work, and find your own way of application. In Vision 8, we come to the end of the second corner. And the two books that we're using are two books by two women. One of them, Hildegard of Bingen, who lived about 800 years ago. And the other, Frances Yates' great book on the art of memory. And she died just about 10, 15 years ago. Hildegard, who was a very tall, red-headed woman who lived about 80 years, and Frances Yates, who had flaming whitish blue hair and was about 6 feet tall and was, like Hildegard, universal genius. Absolute 200 IQ type individual. Female Goethes. We're using these two women to position ourselves because at the very beginning of Vision, we took a pair of texts, one, the apex of the wisdom tradition from the end of the 1st century AD. And the pair to it was a wisdom text some 1400 years later at the peak of the Renaissance of that ancient tradition. The height of the classical world and the height of the Renaissance of that classical world. And that they had a shared vision. And the vision was that learning wisdom involves consciousness, and that consciousness functions when memory is operative. So in the second corner, we take a woman of the 20th century who writes about the memory tradition, and a woman of the 12th century who writes about visionary sequences, and put them together. Now, the third pair of texts that we're going to be with for 4 weeks are by two of the greatest magicians of the English language. I say magicians because they were truly able to use the English language in a magical way. They also happen to be the two of the greatest poets of the English language, Shakespeare and Shelley. We're going to take Shakespeare's last great play, The Tempest, and Shelley's last great dramatic poem, Prometheus Unbound. And that'll be the third corner for Vision. And when we're turned loose on the 13th week, the book that we will take, the single solitary book, to complete that square of vision will be the mystical poems of Rumi. And if you have any acquaintance with Rumi at all, the greatest Sufi poet of all time, you'll know that nothing can be paired with Rumi. But he forms Rumi, Shakespeare and Shelley, Francis Yates, Hildegard of Bingen, the Hermetic Poimandres treatise, Pico della Mirandola. These form a great square of vision. And we use books not as textbooks in some kind of scholastic medieval way, but we use pairs of books like a calipers, like a tuning fork, like a way of sizing up for ourselves where these elusive corners of conscious vision might be, and to give us at least some kind of provisional frame of reference through which to look. And when we look, what we see increasingly is ourselves. And so following vision is a whole section on art. And right at the very beginning of art, the very first pair of books, the very first corner that we have, are two of the most arcane of all 20th century artists, Kandinsky and Max Ernst. Let's take a break and we'll come back. Before the break, we talked about how things advance. Now we have to remind ourselves that it's never so easy. And there are times when it doesn't happen. And there are whole ages where it doesn't happen. And sometimes there are whole centuries in which everything slides and regresses. And there are some times when advances have been forgotten, and if they're not able to be reconstituted through remembering, they have to be redeveloped from scratch, and sometimes that takes a long time. When we look at Hildegard of Bingen, for example, we have two of her major works here, the Sixtieth and the Book of Divine Works. And if we look at the structure, the Sixtieth is a series of 13 visions, and the Book of Divine Works is a series of 10 visions. So she's a tremendously talented human being, but 800 years ago, visions had a very peculiar flavor. Let's read the opening sentences of both works. You'll, notice a parallel, but also a problem. Declaration. This is the beginning of the Sixtieth. These are true visions flowing from God. And behold, in the 49th year of my earthly course, as I was gazing with great fear and trembling attention at a heavenly vision, I saw a great splendor in which resounded a voice from heaven saying to me, O fragile human, ashes of ashes and filth of filth, say and write what you see and hear. But since you are timid in speaking, and simple in expounding, and untaught in writing, speak and write these things not by a human mouth, and not by the understanding of human invention, and not by the requirements of human composition, but as you see and hear them on high, in the heavenly places, in the wonders of God. One recognizes in this kind of tone the tone of apocalyptic writing. One comes across this kind of writing in the apocalyptic prophets, like in the Old Testament of, say, Isaiah, or in the book that is known as the Book of Enoch, written about 200 BC, Isaiah about 700 BC. Isaiah, in response to the Neo-Babylonian Empire coming and seizing, been painfully achieved over millennia, was suddenly torn by the ambition to have Hellenistic kings. That the whole political setup no longer be that of a tradition of time honored, but to be something like we want to be a part of a powerful Hellenistic kingdom. And in fact, within 30 years of the writing of Enoch, one saw that the temple in Jerusalem became a pagan temple, and one was killed if one practiced traditional Judaism in the temple in Jerusalem under Antiochus IV. So it was a time of great travail, of psychic trauma, of historical tearing, similar to at the time of Isaiah. And one can go to other cultures, other traditions, and find very similar to Hildegard. The similarity is that vision is something that becomes almost impossible to have only under wrenching, traumatic tearing of the fabric of integration. Let's look at the other part. What was happening in the 1100s? In the 1100s was just the first basic stirrings from what used to be called the Dark Ages. Centuries of ignorance. Centuries where there was no creativity. There was no real personality. Bertrand Russell once in his History of Western Philosophy said that for about 600 years, one couldn't find a single thinker that went above a gray plane of mediocrity, except one or two individuals who had no real effect. There might be, I think Russell said there was only one spike of genius in all that time. John Scotus Eriugena, who was the tutor at the time of Charlemagne and made the Carolingian Renaissance, which petered out. But in 500 or 600 years, almost 700 years, mediocrity. Mediocrity in the sense that vision was something that was torrentially perilous. It was painful. One didn't want to have this. One wanted to hide underneath the ceiling of comforting doctrine, under the protection of scholastic, logical abstraction. And that below that, one could at least live. One could live on a primitive level. One could live on the village level. But almost no one emerged through that ceiling to a level that we would recognize today as being personally mobile and a wide spectrum of civilized possibility. No one. It didn't matter what station of life you were in, whether you were a king or a serf. Everyone was under the ceiling of visionary rejection. One could not have this. And so Hildegard is not at all an inferior individual. She is one of the best of all time. She's one of the most intelligent people of all time. In the 1100s, she was an intellectual genius whose great writing correspondence partner was Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the masterminds of that time. She was on that par. But for her, visions were a terrible, perilous, threatening exposure to something beyond oneself. Again, instead of there being a transcendental wisdom, it had reverted back and had become a savage terrorism, a fearful ecstasis, not an ecstasy of humane transition, but an ecstasis of devastation. One feared to have anything to do with this. This was not at all an ecstasy that one would desire, but something one would fear. And the terror was not something that one could cope with. One was completely inundated by it. And yet 200 years later, just 200 years later, one finds a very quiet poet named Geoffrey Chaucer who writes about love visions in such an elegant, easy, humane way, as if it were just simply something that cultivated men and women did as a part of their life. That the love visions of Chaucer in the mid of 1300s, just 200 years later, that something had changed, that once a penetration had been made through this ceiling of vision, that the penetration allowed for then a humane exploration of the cycle of consciousness again. Something which had been available in antiquity, not only in classical antiquity, but in very ancient antiquity. We used as an example in the myth section the ancient mythic cycle of Inanna, written by the daughter of Sargon of Akkad some 4,400 years ago. And in Inanna, in Heiduanna, the daughter of Sargon, writes this beautiful epical cycle of the feminine being able to go into the underworld and come back again, being able to go into the upper world and come back again, where vision and visionary journeying was a natural, normal part of the expectation of a mature woman's life. And yet 3,300 years later, things had regressed, conditions had become such that for Hildegard, even the thought of such things was absolutely stymieing, and yet 200 years later, Chaucer could write of something like love visions. He did 4 different versions of it even. It was something that one did. And this is 100 years before the Renaissance really began, in which it was just a part of the expectation of the right of mature men and women to have these qualities, the qualities of conscious vision and personal artistry, and the assurance that one could live in a personal history that had the meaning that one put into it. So there are great times, swaths, in which this regression makes what once was a normal part of life so perilous as to seem almost unimaginably horrible. We live in an age now where for a whole generation, people were convinced that any other conscious form of life in the universe was going to be horribly alien. Even just this past year, the Independence Day, the horrible aliens. Power on a scale that would just crush New York City like a lawnmower going through grass. All signs of an illness, all symptoms of a sickness which doctors of civilization by now know only too well. And it isn't a question of just pulling out the little black bag and administering the herbs, making the teas. By now, that has happened so many times over the last 10 to 12,000 years that the doctors are becoming molecular scientists and saying, let's, instead of curing this bout of illness, let's restructure the physiology so it doesn't get sick anymore. If this form of physiology gets sick, then let's restructure the physiology so it doesn't get sick. That's the future medicine. There's a whole different scale of understanding, entirely different dimension. And so an education like this is not to get degrees or to get jobs. It's to restructure your reality so you don't get sick anymore, ever. That's a whole different dimension. That's what's going on. When we look to see something like the complement to Hildegard, to Francis Yates, The Art of Memory. We talked about how here there's the development of the theater, that the theater was a form of mnemonic reminder of the positioning of images into a grid of location based upon the ancient writing that was codified for us in a manuscript of Cicero, who lived in the 1st century BC. Cicero, who got it from his great Stoic teacher Posidonius, who got it through the Pythagorean tradition, and Pythagoras, who got it from the ancient Iranians and the ancient Egyptians, who developed it thousands of years before them. That the art of memory in Cicero, in his little book called Ad Herennium, to Herennius, a letter. Very often, someone like Cicero, his original works are letters, or they're law cases, or they're little monographs on certain things. And this monograph, Ad Herennium, contains the essence of an art of memory. The code for it was loci et foci, locus or place, and foci, focus. To focus, to concentrate a focus which has a set place. And that if one makes a interlocking grid pattern of organization of places, and one has the power to focus and make the focus condensed to images, and then the images all wrapped in a single symbol, and one then puts symbols in various relational places, and one knows how to go in and have an ordination to all those places to know where this place is in the grid of all the places, and to be able to see this symbol in that place and to open it up and see all the images indexed under that symbol, that one can remember an astounding array, an incredible ability. And that this memory, this capacity, was such as would astound us in the present day, where there's no memory training whatsoever. There was a whole era from the 1790s until about the 1950s, about 150 years, where classical scholars doubted that Homer could ever have been an oral literature, had to have been written down, because no one could remember something as large as the Iliad, as large as the Odyssey. From the time of Wolff's monograph in 1795, where he said in his Prolegomena to the study of Homer, it had to be written, and written language in the Greek is recent, therefore Homer has to be recent. Until the discoveries by Milman Parry, mucking around in what used to be Yugoslavia, found that there were Slavic storytellers who still remembered epics many times the size of the Iliad in the 20th century. And that the development of memory capacity was truly astounding, and that a trained human being can be trained to remember almost an indefinite amount of material. The Mahabharata is 12 times the size of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. And there are in India traditional tellers of the Mahabharata. Are you going to let some kind of Hindu storyteller outdo you by exponential capacities? What turns out, as Frances Yates says, as she points out in her book, The Art of Memory, is that the whole development of theater, of so-called plays on a stage within a theater, had something to do with the development of consciousness, with the organization of the function of memory, and that memory and theater went together in such a way that the two functions very often came together and were held together by a discipline that's known today and was known then and was known in antiquity as mathematics. That's mathematically resolvable, cinchable, exact. And that the greatest development of this art of memory in a theater, the greatest development in the whole world, was done in Elizabethan England. The greatest production of all time of this style of consciousness was in the city of London in a theater called the Globe. Called the Globe because the entire world was available from there. That someone who was able to function completely in the globe and what went on there was free to go anywhere in the world and carry with them their full mature capacities. It was at the time of the building of the first theaters in London that you find the first great voyages of the English going out everywhere in the world simply to appropriate it. Not to appropriate the land so much, but to stake out the fact that the oceans of the planet belong to the English Empire. Rule Britannia is a feminine song made for Elizabeth I. Have you never seen Errol Flynn and the Seahawk? Yeah, it was real. It happened. It made what became the British Empire. The theme, "The Sun Never Sets in the British Empire," was a theme that it was a cosmic scope. The whole planet was the purview of that focus, which had as its campfire, as its alchemical refining campfire, the Globe Theatre on Bankside in London. And Shakespeare was part owner of it. He wrote the plays and was part owner. So it's Shakespeare's drama in the Globe Theatre was built for his plays. And in fact, the Globe suffered several traumatic experiences. The second Globe burnt to a ground in 1660 in the Great Fire of London. But so tenacious were the individuals in England that they rebuilt the Globe Theatre. Here's a little book, Rebuilding Shakespeare's Globe. Here's an article from the LA Times. Wednesday, August 21st, 1996. Shakespeare's Globe Theatre is finally back in business. Rebuilt completely. Two Gentlemen of Verona playing tonight. It is a training ground. It is a focus. It's an alchemical refining fire of making sure that the threshold of vision is supple, that it's easy for men and women to make those transformations out of the natural cycle into the conscious cycle, so that vision is something that is a part of the expectation of maturity. That yes, it is supernatural. Yes, it is magical. But that the supernatural and the magical are not some kind of occult razzmatazz, but a normal part of the transcendent function of consciousness, of the conscious maturity of spiritual men and women, that we belong in those realms because those realms were not made before us in any way whatsoever. That those realms are there because they're resonance of our own functioning there. And to the extent that we function there, those realms are real. And to the extent that no one functions there, those realms are empty. The greatest refinement of these transcendental initiations was done by a group of people who are very good at refining a product down to the number one simplest, the Japanese. And Japanese Zen refined it down to one koan. Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. The koan known as Mu. And if you don't laugh at it, then you have to go back and meditate and look at the rake sand for another 1,000 years. It's that kind of a situation that the realm of consciousness is a resonance of those who are living it. And to the extent that they are living it, then that realm is real. To the extent that they do not live it, that realm is diminished. A better way to say it, heaven's gate is wide open, but the expanse of heaven is only as far as you've explored. If you've only gone to the moon, then you only know as far as the moon in heaven. And the rest of the 20 billion light years are just open wilderness waiting. Are you going to let some other kind of fearsome alien beings take your land from you before you even take a look? Those are revolutionary words. Especially imaginary beings? Are you going to be buffalo? Don't get me started. What I'm trying to show and disclose and display is that our whole transcendent conscious functioning is available to us, and that if you make it difficult to get there, it can be really difficult. You can make it almost forbidding. There's no need to do that. The techniques that have been developed by men and women over the last 5,000 years to this challenge make it a super highway, 25 lanes in both directions. Is no big thing to be transcendental in the late 20th century, in the early 21st century. What stops us is not the terror and the peril, but the abject apathy and disbelief that we're worth it. The untenacious lackadaisicalness of just not caring to do it. Those men and women didn't pioneer all this for you to whimper no. There's a wonderful little speech that the 20-year-old John Wayne makes in Raoul Walsh's great epic of 1930, The Big Trail. The pioneers have gotten into the snowstorm where the Donner Party perished and had to go into cannibalism to survive. And the young 20-year-old John Wayne spouts some lines, and he said, there's a whole long line of people that got us here. And they crossed a whole Atlantic Ocean in boats that would have sank in high waves. Are you going to let a little snow stop us here when we're within a day's march to get through and get to the new life that we want? It's for us that we came here. But it's for them and their courage that we remind ourselves now to keep living. It's this kind of equality. It's this kind of a simple understanding. It's the pioneer ethos, if you need to be American about it. That what's West now is the other side of apathy. And you can tell yourself anything as long as you go. You can promise yourself in any dimension whatever reward you need. just keep, what was the phrase in the 60s that Cobb used to have in his cartoon? Just keep trucking. One more step and one more step. That there's something efficacious in that. In the design of the Globe Theater, in Shakespeare's refining fire, campfire, the Globe was designed by a group of individuals who had as their mentor a teacher, a single individual, a man whose name was John Dee. And in fact, the sequel to Francis Yates's The Art of Memory has a design on the cover, a design that everyone recognizes, the man spread out with the arms and legs and head in a circle. We recognize that as Leonardo da Vinci's great contribution. The symbol of man as a star. That man's body is the guiding star. Man's body in its wholeness, surrounded by the circle of possibility, is a guiding star. It's not only a symbol which preserves meaning, but it's a talisman which discloses meaning. That an amulet preserves meaning by integration, but that same symbol can be talismanic in that it gives out its meaning in application. And it's the application of meaning that requires consciousness. The integration of meaning is something that's still within the natural cycle. It still happens naturally. Meaning is condensed into the genes and into the chromosomes, even of plants and animals. They know what to do in life in order to be. They remember. But the remembrance is in the body. But for consciousness, remembrance has to be in the resonance of the mind. And if the mind isn't given its form, the mind doesn't have any resonance. By making the mind formed like a bell, then when something occurs in the mind, it resonates. And those resonant waves make consciousness. And consciousness then is a field for inquiry, an open possibility. Wherever your heart takes you, wherever your vision sees, on whatever scale you need to. Here, in the sequel to The Art of Memory, Francis Yates writes Theater of the World, with the frontispiece of John Dee. And in here she writes, Dee gives two basic references, the geometry of the square and the geometry of the circle. And the two of them together are the basis for the theory of proportion. And one can take this architecturally back to Vitruvius, back to Roman times, but in Vitruvius you will never find any compacted esoteric understanding, because in Vitruvius it was simply the way that one built solidly, and one didn't have to have an esoteric understanding. But when you go back to that time, when you go back to the Roman age, when the origins of this architectural sense of proportion were applicable, one finds there a great mind, a great writer, totally ignored in our day, totally ignored by universities, because he's known classically as a rhetorician. Doesn't write dramas, doesn't write poetry, doesn't write philosophy. He writes a book about how to use language, how to use spoken language, and how to use written language properly. The Art of Rhetoric. His name is, we know him as Quintilian. Marcus Fabius Quintilianus was his Roman name. Quintilian's Institutes, the institute Institutio Oratio, the Institutio Oratoria of Quintilian, written in the 1st century AD. Quintilian is born about 35 AD and died about, say, in the late 90s AD. So he's roughly a contemporary with St. John. He writes in here that there's a complete difference between figures of speech and figures of mind. That the figures of speech have a quality that's there for the ear and for feeling to decide what is the right proportion, what's the right cadence, what's the right pace. But figures in the mind depend not upon hearing, but upon seeing. Not upon feeling, but upon thought. And that great architecture is an architecture which needs to be seen in the mind and understood by thought, so that there's such a thing as a structure which informs the actuality of the building. And one of the greatest buildings that can be made in Quintilian's version of it is the architecture of the mind. Later, this will be developed about 150 years after Quintilian in the great writings of Plotinus, where he talks about the architecture of reality. By the time of Plotinus, about 260 AD, human intelligence was such that one could understand that the person was a point of exploration that could draw out the plans of the whole universe and understand that the cosmos itself had an architecture. That God's house was the cosmos, was all of the stars on all of the levels together as a place for living in. That God's house was a temple which was the cosmos itself, and that man could understand that architecture. It is not at all some wimp sniveling fearfully to have some vision of transcendence, but inherited this house as one of the family. On that scale, in the Epistle to the Hebrews, Apollos of Alexandria wrote, he said, "To whatever angels did God say, 'You are my sons'?" They're messengers who work on the staff. They're not family who live in the house. It's a whole different scale. Quintilian also, in his great admiration for Cicero, in Book 11 of the Institutes on rhetorical oration, presents the other art of memory that wasn't in Cicero, because he was writing a letter to a young man, Herennius, who needed to have just the grade school art of memory. And that the early Renaissance got the Ciceronian art of memory, loci et foci, but that there was a much more powerful, mature art of memory that you give when you're finishing up the education and preparing a mature human being to go out and create a life, create a world. There's another art of memory. Here is a little bit of Quintilian. Probably nobody in Los Angeles has read it in the last 15 years. At whatever level. Professors, wherever. UCLA, wherever. Some regard memory as being no more than one of nature's gifts, and this view is no doubt true to a great extent. But like everything else, memory may be improved by cultivation. You can learn to consciously refigure. So instead of having just figures of speech with images, or even figures of speech with images that are condensed into symbols, one can open up those symbols and have conscious resonances, even to the point of cosmic consonance. Then memory is something else. It may be improved by cultivation. And all the labor of which I have so far spoken, all the labor of 3 volumes and a half before this, all of the great things that man can do, all of this is in vain. It's of no use whatsoever unless all the other departments be coordinated by the animating principle of memory. It's the breath of spiritual life that allows it to live and be. An education without it is a static, dead image, wonderfully complex, a tapestry of immense complexity which hangs on the wall, which lays on the page. It doesn't have any spiritual life at all, but there is an art of memory in its mature form that gives it that. For our whole education depends upon memory, and we shall receive instruction all in vain if all we hear slips from us, while it is the power of memory alone that brings before us all the store of precedents, laws, rulings, sayings, facts, which the orator must possess in abundance, and which he must always hold ready for immediate use. Indeed, it is not without good reason that memory has been called the treasure house of eloquence. And he goes on. He goes on to say that it is totally mysterious, not because we don't understand it, but because we do practice it and do understand to some extent and know that it's mysterious. For while we are saying one thing, he says memory is so important that all other mental activities are subsumed under it. I'll come back to this next week so the tapes have it. For while we are saying one thing, we must be considering something else that we are going to say. Consequently, since the mind is always looking ahead, it is continually in search of something which is more remote. On the other hand, whatever it discovers, it deposits by some mysterious process in the safekeeping of memory, which acts as a transmitting agent and hands on to the delivery of what it has received from the imagination. I do not conceive, however, that I need dwell upon the question of the precise function of memory, although many hold the view that certain impressions are made upon the mind, analogous to those which a signet ring makes on wax. That's Cicero's art of memory. Nor again shall I be so credulous in view of the fact that the retentiveness or slowness of the memory depends upon our physical condition, as to venture to allot a special art to memory. He goes on to say that memory is so mysterious that not only does it work both ways at once, that we remember what was before and we're able spontaneously to say something which we never said before originally because of memory, but that this capacity, even after you get trained, extends into your sleep and changes your dreams. That memory is so powerful that it re-indexes the whole mythic horizon of dreaming, which means that, like a jewel cutter, it recuts the entire range of experience into something new. Why live like some kind of serf in an ignorant level where you're just the raw ore, when you can bring the jewels of yourself out by the play of consciousness? This is what's being said. This is just rhetorical learning. Just. The difference between medieval miracle plays and Shakespeare is the development of the Cicero and Quintilian art of memory in its application. When one looks at a play like Shakespeare's The Tempest, as we will look at, one looks at a colossal demonstration of conscious capacity. And the very subject of The Tempest, the very core of the whole play, is a magician who could make things happen just by saying so, and learns that he has to hold that power in abeyance because otherwise love will not happen. That love needs to flow out of a natural relationality, and it can extend itself into the magical realms of consciousness, but could also be impaired by an injudicious use of magical visionary power. He has to learn to set his books aside in order to let his daughter be married. More next week. Bring your Shakespeare and Shelley.